Welcome in the evening, and I hope you will bear with me. I will try to be brief and give my lecture for an hour or less, and then we will open up for discussion and talk a little together about what we have heard. I have prepared different slides for tonight, and the focus will be asking if there can be a Geiger counter for Holocaust radioactivity. So most of the things I will talk about is in my book Holocaust Trauma, where you can see it's divided into Holocaust trauma in itself. What is it? Of course, there are different kinds of Holocaust trauma with the survivors, and then we have the child survivors, the children of survivors, the grandchildren, and then we have a different kind of Holocaust trauma which is in Israel and in Germany and Austria. And then the last chapter deals with the question of how could it all happen, and I talked about something I called unconditional hate, which is a similar concept than unconditional love, which we all know exists from mother to a child. And there is also something called unconditional hate, where you hate someone not because the person does something or is something, but just in itself. Most of the things I know about these subjects is coming from AMCHA, where I have worked for more than 20 years. And I don't have time to present the whole work of AMCHA, but many of you know that AMCHA is a treatment center for Holocaust survivors and the second generation. So I will focus this evening on something that we will call Transgenerational Transmission of Trauma. If we ask ourselves, what's in our bag? What's in your bag? And try to answer this question. How much did your parents' traumatic experiences influence you? Was it a lot? Was it just a little? Or didn't it influence you at all? If we would have time, we would go around, but we won't have time to do that here. But every one of us have a small pekela that we carry around, that inside it we carry the traumatic experiences of our parents. And this emotional baggage we have from our parents, the Jewish Israeli children of survivors, many of them carry their parents' Holocaust trauma. But since I talk here in Germany, and then I've worked a lot in Austria also, I have come to understand there is something also called Holocaust trauma that German and Austrian kids and grandchildren carry with them from their parents and grandparents past. And I'm sure that every one of you who grew up in these countries and in Central Europe have some stories of your grandparents or parents' war experiences. And the question is, how much did that influence you? Did it influence us at all? How much does it influence us until this day? And the basic questions really is, if parental traumatization can be passed between generations, is it at all possible? If we look at the old lady who was living during the war, can her experiences be transmitted to her child? And can then the grandchild also get these same experiences, and perhaps even the fourth generation? Can this be passed on from one generation? Can the experiences from the first generation be transmitted to the fourth generation? That is the basic question. Does it leave any scars? And what I will talk about a little more later is, can the memories which happened to the first generation be transmitted to the second one, and even to the fourth one? Can the child remember what the parent has forgotten? Let's say that the grandparent has repressed the experiences. Can the grandchild have dreams that reminds them of what the first generation had? I asked the question, I don't have the clear answer, but we will talk about these. These are the more or less the questions. Because the scars from the Holocaust are so deep, and what happened there and then is so was so terrible that we ask if the accumulated residues of emotional pain will remain in subsequent generations. We have 4 post-war generations, and we talk about the different generations since the World War I. The first ones were the veterans, the survivors. Then we have the baby boomers. The second, the early ones who were born in the 50s. Then we have the children of child survivors, and then we have the grandchildren, and the third G, and the fourth G. Can you identify yourself in any of these? Can you point out which one you belong to? Perhaps most of you belong to the millennials, who were born around the year 2000. And again, since we have this setting, I cannot talk about it, and we cannot share so much about it. So these things have been researched for so many years, really since the 1960s, and then on every 10 years I have summarized the research done. During the first early years, mostly there were case studies of patients who came to therapy, and they told the therapist about their experiences, and so there were a lot of observational knowledge, and the therapist, they wrote the case presentations, and then they started to write papers which were descriptive studies. Later there were more controlled studies, and even later people were trying to integrate what was learned from these studies. But every 10 years things changed, and we re-evaluated the findings. Now when we're reaching the 20s, we were starting to look for biomarkers of Holocaust trauma. And of course, during the last 2 years, we have been asking, how did the COVID-19 pandemic influence the second generation, or the third, or the fourth generation? Now, there were quite a few milestones where new books came out. 1971, there was an important book, and then there was the starting of the gatherings, 2009, where people from all over the world met and shared their experiences as a second generation. Now, look at this list. What is the most obvious thing that you can learn from this list? It's something I just recently have found out. The studies from the 60s or the 70s, they looked at the group of people they studied who were in their 50s or 40s or 30s. But later studies, they were looking at a different age group, right? So what we're really learning, that specific studies should be understood from when these studies were made. They might not have been the same people when they were 20s or 30s that they were when they were 50s or 60s, right? Because each stage of life, there are various stages of life, and each stage of life demands a different kind of coping mechanism. Each stage of development requires a different coping strategy, right? So we were looking at the sort of same kind of population, but they were not the same anymore, because life goes on, right? Life is a development. Life is a life course developmental review of, like a kind of journey of post-war adjustment. We're not the same that we were 10 or 20 years ago. We all change all the time. And so the perception of the Holocaust and its impact on us gradually shifted. And that's something I now have emphasized even more during the last years. We don't look at these populations as something that if you're a child of survivors, then you are like this or like that. But depending on how old you are, that you look at it, then it will affect how we look at it. So we have a very basic schema of looking at TTT, which I call it Transgenerational Transmission of Trauma. We have two parents, father and a mother, who were in the war. They experienced Holocaust trauma. And then they were transmitting something upon the child, and who would then have secondary trauma, right? Now, what was transmitted is not very clear. What was transmitted from the first to the second? How was it transmitted? And then when was it transmitted? What did the parents actually do? And how did the child, or how did the children respond to what they did? All these things are different, make a big difference from one to another. There is a difference between inter and transgenerational transmission of trauma. Let's say that the parent were abusive to the child. That means, in effect, that the child experienced first-hand trauma. It was not a second-hand trauma, right? If a parent hit the child, then that child becomes an abused child, and it's not transmission. It's an intergenerational way that the parent might have reacted as he was experiencing his own childhood. Now, for a transmission to be transgenerational, it has to be to the third or fourth generation, where there is no direct contact. Let's say that the parent was a good enough mother or a good enough father, but still the child experienced some kind of secondary trauma and has dreams about the Holocaust. Now, some basic research findings. The first question you will ask is, are children of survivors suffering from mental problems? This was the first kind of question that the studies asked. And clinicians found, of course, clinicians saw only patients, and they found, of course, that they saw a clinical population, and they saw, of course, a lot of problems. But the meta-studies, the big studies of a big population, didn't find any difference between the children of survivors and other population. We don't ask that question anymore. We know that there is only a small percentage of the children of survivors who suffer more from mental problems than other people. So it's not if children of survivors are suffering, but who. Who among the children of survivors are suffering? And we have found that the second generation with negative reparative adaptational impact were more affected. What does that mean? It means that those who did not recuperate during the war, during all the years that went by, they are suffering more. And there are, of course, some of this, a small group who have not recuperated. Now, can we identify specific biomarkers of those who suffer? This is something I will talk about later. Some other research findings. The adverse reaction, the more psychopathology like PTSD in the second generation, and the vulnerability we have found. might be seen as a curse. So a child of survivor might experience it as a curse. But there is also something beneficial in being a child of survivor, which we have identified as resilience. So we have a legacy from the war, that if we nurture it and we have made the proper transformation, we can see that there are many things that have contributed for our creativity or post-traumatic growth. So we have seen that coming out of the Holocaust as a child or as a grandchild has not only a negative but also a positive, because we have learned that there is a lot of resilience that comes with it. And resilience and vulnerabilities can be two sides of the same coin, which is quite strange, but it actually does exist. You can be very vulnerable, but you can also be very strong and resilient, because then you know that if you have fallen far enough, you can also know how to get up. So most survivors and their children have normal lives, and specific vulnerabilities may appear only under adverse situations and are interwoven with family dynamics. Presently, during the last perhaps 10 or 20 years, there has been a shift of research from looking at the transgenerational transmission of trauma as part of the family dynamics. I put these Russian dots that we see how we have carried the legacy from our parents and from our family. Today it's more like everything is computerized, so it's more like a computer program that we are looking at. So we look at the more from a neurobiological type. And another shift that has come is from healing traumatization to promoting resilience. Before we talked a lot about the psychopathology of Holocaust traumatization or about transmission. Now we talk more about the resilience, how to build resilience, and how to get healing from the promotion of resilience. Another shifting studies has been that we look more individually. Of each person has a different story. Because, you know, only some children have, it's like heredity. Only some children may be hit more strongly. Let's say that we have in the first place, the father has a strong Holocaust trauma, that the father was quite affected by the trauma. Then we will see that only one of the children might have been affected strongly, or a few of them, and perhaps only one of the grandchildren, or perhaps only two of them. But you see, most of the children in this picture have not been affected. It's like heredity. You get it, but many of them don't get it. Another thing is that the studies have become much more complicated. We look now much more about the biological, neurobiological, and epigenetic transmission. So the main assumptions we have that a stressful event was experienced by the parent, but not by the child. That this event had an observational neurobiological effect on the parent, who would be then diagnosed as suffering from PTSD. This would leave an observable mark in the parent, and that this same mark would be observable also in the child and shown to lead to susceptibility to stress. So, for example, let's say that the parent worked in the crematorium to take the bodies and to cremate them. And the father had difficulties afterwards with the smell of dead people. Now the child, when he makes barbecue, might also have the same sensitivity to the smell of burnt flesh. This sensitivity might actually come from something being transmitted. Now the son might not be aware that this biological transmission has happened and has come from the parent. This has been proven in a biological laboratory. Like they took some mice and they made them sensitive to a specific smell of a flower. And every time the mouse, the first generation mouse, have this smell, they got an aversive reaction, and they couldn't stand this smell. Now they made a child from the same mouse, but didn't let that child of the mouse be together with the parent, so they could not learn it. Then they gave the child the same flower, and the mouse was still very sensitive. This is a flower that usually mice don't have sensitivity to. They continued the experiment and even saw that in the third generation, even in the fourth generation, the mice were sensitive. Now, this is called the epigenetic research, and this has been shown in many different animals. It's like the associations happening, after the Holocaust, survivors and also children of survivors, they see a train and they associate that it was the train that led to Auschwitz. It's like some kind of a computer virus that we might have in our head, in the brain, that associated us with something that has nothing to do whatsoever with the original Holocaust trauma. The same thing with association, a shower. You probably heard about Holocaust survivors who are afraid to take a shower because they don't know what will come out from the shower, if it's gas or if it's water. Or when we had the gas masks during the war, they are afraid to put it on. Or the wooden shoes, or Schäfer dog, and soldier, and bread, to keep bread. So we ask, what factors predispose an individual to associate a variety of neutral stimuli with threatening ones? And we basically ask a simple question: where is the bug in our head? It says we have a computer virus in our head that mistakes the associations with something that has nothing to do with it. So we are searching for the bug, and we call today the bug is the biomarkers. Where are the biomarkers of Holocaust traumatization? So we look at the question now, like we have a hardware, which is more or less in our DNA or in our brain. We have the software, which is how was the brain programmed, and how was the body, how was the DNA. And in genetic language we call it methylation. So we have a program, and we have physiological signals. We have the function and we have the emotion. And the possible biomarkers of Holocaust traumatization can be looked for in epigenetic methylation of specific genes. In neuroanatomy, which is the brain, we can look for it in specific brain regions, and in the neuroendocrine system, which is the HPA dysregulation. So we are looking for neurobiological correlates to possible biomarkers. We look at the cellular and organic and so on. When we talk about the epigenetic marks, we basically look at it from the point of view, many of the survivors who were in the concentration camps, they got the numbers marked on their hands. When we look at the second generation, it's as if the children of survivors and the grandchildren also have marks, but they don't have the marks on the hair, but they have the symbolic marks on the genes, which we call epigenetic marks. They will change the transcription potential of the genes and give them flawed instructions on certain cues. It looks like, it sounds even like science fiction, right? But it's a kind of biological memory we have in our body. So we ask if it's possible to erase epigenetic marks if they were created after we were born. And that's something that we can say if we were influenced by the environment and if the epigenetic marks were influenced by it. So we have to ask when were these epigenetic marks given to us? When were they transmitted? So we have a few critical periods in the transmission of stress, for example. We have the hereditary disposition where we are actually born with the epigenetic marks. We have the gametes, which is the sperm or the egg of the mother. And then we have, it can be transmitted during the pregnancy, while when the mother is in very high stress. Let's say that the mother was pregnant during the war. Let's say she was in the camp, or she was after the camp in the DP camp, and she was pregnant with a child, and because of the fear that she had, she might have affected the child, the unborn child. Or it might be early after birth, because we know for sure that very small children are very affected by the mother's affect state after she was born. If she was still afraid of that the child would not be alive anymore because of her experiences, she might transmit the fear to her child. My mother, when she was giving birth to my brother, she was still affected by an illness, and she was not allowed to touch my older brother. And so we might hypothesize, we might assume that part of his problem were delivered just immediately after the war. And it can be then, of course, later in time after birth, during parenting in general. So our assumption of inherited Holocaust trauma is sort of about that the parent was born, usually the mother was then transmitting her trauma to the unborn child through some kind of a biological process in the DNA. And we ask, can such a Holocaust trauma then be transmitted through the umbilical cord? That the trauma from the parent would be then. And we look at the fetal origins, that the exposure of developing tissue in adverse conditions during critical periods of development can permanently reprogram the body and give rise to disease later in life. You know, maternal affection early in life may influence adult stress levels. That we know from a lot of research from animals and from people. And I think it's quite common sense also that the child, the infant, will be affected. There is a lot of relevant journals for those who will read about there are a lot of studies now recently coming out, usually from animal studies. Recent progress in epigenetic inheritance have made a lot of progress. And a recent review from this year summarized the emerging evidence from epigenetic inheritance. And we can see that we have seen that many mental illnesses actually have some kind of an epigenetic source. So we have the DNA with the 46 chromosome, but then we also have the methylation, the DNA methylation, which is some kind of a tap on the DNA, which is actually giving the DNA the signal to activate or to deactivate. And what makes then the TTT, the transmission switch on? We can have a latent disposition of a specific problem, but then we can also have active manifestation. And many years of brain research has shown that human beings are hardwired for stress through an intricate pattern of neural pathways designated for the fight and flight response. Trauma survivors show a disposition of vulnerability to stress, but PTSD doesn't always switch on. Only some people get it, while others do not. And these who get it then would have epimutations, which is this methylation. So we have some kind of an inherited stress response system where the parent have some kind of a predisposition to have stress. You can just imagine someone going through the Holocaust for a year or two and has experienced severe stress and have had severe Holocaust trauma, that this has affected the whole stress system, which is always in balance. The HPA axis is always should be in a balance of stress and relaxation. And if it's not in balance, it can ruin the whole stress response system. And so that this same stress response system might have been then transmitted to the child also, who then might have inherited the implicit memories of the parent, not the explicit ones, but the implicit ones. So this is more or less, I don't have time to get into the whole stress response system. We look at neurobiological research which is going on all over the world. They look at the blood and the urine and many different biomarkers to see what we can learn from it. We can also look at the brain and to see if there is anything specific about inherited brain damage. That if the parent has been have cumulative traumatic stress, that it can cause some irreversible impact on the brain of the survivors. And we ask, could these same effects be passed on to the children? You might have heard about the amygdala, for example, how it regulates the emotions in the brain. If something happened to the amygdala of the parent, can it then be transmitted to the child? Or the hippocampus, which is regulating the memories more or less. Can these same biomarkers be found also in the child? And the hypothesis is that repeated excessive cortisol accelerated hippocampus aging and damages brain cells in the amygdala. And will they cause also hereditary predisposition, susceptibility to PTSD in the child? If something is too much, if you've experienced sometimes the stress is too much, something happens in our whole system, in our brain, in our feeling, in our emotional system, that we cannot cope with it anymore, and then something happens with it. So we look at specific brain regions, and if you read some of the papers, you will see a lot of studies of fMRI or MRI studies looking at specific brain regions. And the long-term potentiation in the hippocampus is one area where they look at mostly. So I have looked at my own brain, of course, because I have some neurological problems. So I made a lot of MRI in my brain, and this is actually my own brain, which I have focused. And if you look at it very carefully, you will see different areas in the brain, and I can look at it inside my brain, and of course I cannot see exactly what is there inside, but the interest is what is inside, where can I find my own Holocaust trauma transmission within my own brain. And perhaps in the future we will be able to see exactly where we can find these memories of Holocaust in our brain. What is burning inside? So there are many biological systems involved, I will not go into it. And there is something which I find very interesting, because our memories can leave traces which are called engrams. Someone many years ago, in 1904, called Semon, he introduced this term engram, but at that time there was no technological advances that nobody could look into the brain so to see it. But actually during the last years, people have started to look at the actual memories within the brain and to see how it happens and when it puts on and when it gets off. There is a cell membrane called membrane around it that activates or does not activate to semiconductors. It's like a semiconductor. The nerve cells, we can now look at the nerve cells, and we can look at what is triggered within the genes. The genes most studies, these are the ones, I will not go into detail about it, but they have specific names. And the last one, the FKB5, you're probably all very familiar with the FKB5 at this point. Has been shown that it regulates the stress response. So Rachel Yehuda from the States, who's been researching this, she found that she made a study with, first of all, with 19 Holocaust survivors, and then looked at their children, also a small group of their children, and then she found that the FKB5 was methylated in the same places, both in the parent and in the children, and she then published her report on that, which was the first report on actual findings of a gene that could regulate a response and to show. This was a methylated GR gene who told actually the body to please send less glucocorticoid now or not. If you're more interested in it in detail, you can easily find the papers and read the papers on it. I will not go into this. Now, Rachel Yehuda and her team also acknowledged afterwards, after a year or two after getting criticized, that this was such a small population that it is not possible still to attribute intergenerational effects in humans to a single set of biological or other determinants at this time. Now we're talking about a few years ago this was published. Then she published a new paper in 2020, still 2 years ago, with a larger population, and she found a similar correlation between parents and children. Now, can you imagine, after we have all experienced for 2 years now the pandemic. Probably many of us have been doing the PCR test, polymerase chain reaction test, where they put this and they take this, they put it through a machine, and it actually looks at our genes, right? It actually can can look at the RNA, not only on the DNA, but at the RNA, which is affecting us. It's a tremendous progress of how quick we can do. Before it used to take a week or 2 weeks or a month or a year to get a reading of the DNA, right? Today we go to a lab and in a few hours we get the reading. This means that we might be able very soon to test our susceptibility to PTSD very quickly if they find the gene and the exact place where something in our genetic setup has been disturbed in the past. And we can also make a lot of research on it because the technological advance has been amazingly fast. And what was funny was that I even saw that Rachel Yehuda took a patent on the specific gene, so if someone will learn that this gene has been specific, showing the vulnerability. Because you remember my question from before, when I started, we asked who is more susceptible to PTSD and who is not. This has tremendous importance for example, when you enlist in the army. You're not supposed to go to the army if you're vulnerable to stress, right? You're not supposed to do many things. So we need to know who is more vulnerable and who is not. Perhaps we can even make such a test before we get married and see how much stress we can have from the marriage and so on. Who knows what future will hold. So we can make a self-test at home and get results in 15 minutes about how we are set up. But let's face it, the present state of research on epigenetic transgenerational transmission inheritance is very early stage, and we lack data across several generations. You can imagine that it's impossible to make controlled research on this, because we would actually have to give the first generation a new experience of stress to be sure that they were actually traumatized enough, and then we would test the second generation. This they do on animals, unfortunately. They scare the hell out of mice, they throw them in water, they give them electrical shocks, they do all kinds of nasty things to animals, and then they have them give birth to the children and grandchildren, and then they see if the same effect was at later generations. Of course, this is impossible for obvious reasons, because of ethical restraints. And so we have treatment outcome studies with biomarkers on both first and second generations are lacking. If we cannot show that the biomarker from first generation is also present in second generation, we cannot prove that TTT actually exists. And so here I will make a cut. Let's go back and look at the Holocaust trauma's radioactive contamination. You remember we used to look at Holocaust traumas almost like an atom bomb exploding. And the explosion left a lot of radioactive waste, like the Chernobyl reaction. Now the radioactive waste affects everyone around it, right? We cannot see what affects us, but we know it in our bodies, we feel it. And the Holocaust trauma by psychoanalytic authors many years ago were symbolically called radioactive contamination. Gampel wrote lots of case presentations on it, and she called it radioactive identification, because many children of survivors talked about something that they felt in the air when they were at home. They felt some kind of a stress. Many German and Austrian children and grandchildren might also feel it when they meet veterans of the war who lived then. They feel there is something strange in the air. Now, let's face it, that there is still no Geiger meter for Holocaust radioactivity. So, as a result, we cannot yet get direct access to the biological footprints of inherited implicit memories of fear, nor directly study the epigenetic switches that control human fear responses. There are many obstacles that we have to face. There are methodological factors that, of course, I already mentioned them, that we cannot study human beings because of ethical reasons. But there are also conceptual factors. We cannot really yet still define what we mean by Holocaust trauma. It can be so many things. There are diversity factors, constancy factors, and adjustment factors. Methodological factors, I mentioned a few of them, but if you look at what I talked about when we looked at different brain regions, when we look at the brain, we cannot see a live brain. We can see the fMRI, but it just looks at the brain as a sculpture. We cannot see what's going on inside. We cannot see the actual electrical and chemical processes happening inside. Now, I know that in animal research they try to do it with optogenetics today, but it's still very early. There are also conceptual factors of PTSD. It's very difficult to define what we actually mean by PTSD. How much stress do we need to inflict on someone that he should be responding with the familiar symptoms of PTSD? Post-traumatic disorders have a time span, right? If the trauma was inflicted, let's say, on the zero, then should the post-traumatic disorders be during the acute stage, or the acute or the chronic PTSD, or the delayed onset PTSD? As a result of these conceptual problems, there are many kinds of PTSD today. Postpartum PTSD and the road of different kinds of PTSD. So it's very difficult to see. When you talk about AMCHA and about the Holocaust survivors, we usually look at it from a year or so. But today, the survivors we see, they experienced it 70 years ago. So what do we see today when we look at it? You perhaps met with a survivor a few weeks ago who told about her experiences. If we would measure what is happening in her body today, would we see the same biological PTSD responses as she had 70 years ago? Probably not, right? Because the responses, they are like footprints in the sand. Even stress responses, even very strong ones. And the emotional scars that he had then and there, they have faded away. And they have perhaps even disappeared totally, like sands, like footsteps in the sand. Because as time goes on, something happens with the body that changes it. So retrospective studies today, for the first generation and the second one and the third one, might not be the same as they were then and there. Because we have shifting environments, adaptability, all the time things change. Since transmission tends to be highly volatile, it will also have to take the adaptability of parents and children into account, as well as the shifting environments and critical periods when the transmission is more likely to occur. a German word I thought about when I came here was Erholung. I mean, to forget that we are all recuperating all the time would be to make disservice to any kind of serious research, right? So we look at a person and we check what kind of biomarkers they have, but it might not be the same biomarkers that they had when the original trauma occurred. Even the cortisol levels, we cannot use them, because the stress responses then and there might have been so different. And you know, when they did the research on the children of survivors on cortisol, you might be familiar with Rachel Yehuda's early research. She found that they had more cortisol in their blood, and then it was counterintuitive because they should have less cortisol. Cortisol is the hormone that should regulate the body's stress responses. And so cortisol is completely useless to look at, because it changes all the time, according to if you make it in the morning or in the evening. And so the next reason why it's so difficult to make these studies is because they are so reductionistic. Neuroscience cannot directly investigate emotional residues without reducing it to something else. Holocaust is so much more, Holocaust trauma is so much more than just a small mark or a small change in our hormones. So what I have found lately is that most of these biological studies, neurobiological studies, is more like the psychobabble that we used to have. It's now neurobabble. Before, we used to say, your id didn't agree with your superego, right, in psychoanalysis in the early years. Now we say that your amygdala didn't agree with your prefrontal cortex. But it's all psychobabble. It doesn't really say anything concretely about what we want to investigate. And perhaps the mind cannot really be found in the body. In German, someone asked, "Wo sitzt der Wille im Gehirn?" And Joshua Lebowitz said, "Der Wille ist nicht im Gehirn, sondern im Besitzer des Gehirns. Das Gehirn ist nur ein Mechanismus." So, in my own efforts to find the biomarkers of Holocaust trauma, I have reached a kind of dead end. Perhaps the search for specific biomarkers doesn't exist. It's like looking for something that doesn't exist. So where do we continue from here, if at all? Which new perspectives of Holocaust trauma transmission is best suited to answer the question of whether parental traumatization can be transmitted to their offspring? Assuming that trauma transmission can indeed be transmitted, how can the aggravating and mitigating factors that increase or decrease the likelihood of offspring psychopathology be further investigated? I think we need a more integrative bio-psycho-social explanatory model to the study of traumatization than pure biological reductionism. It will be a task of the future studies to specify the specific diverse parental, offspring and environmental and time factors. So we go back to our first picture and ask the same questions, but from different perspectives. We need all these variables to look at them. We need a system biology perspective, where we take into consideration the inner and the outer. It's quite a complex environmental biology interface. This conceptual model of the biological embedding of early psychosocial adversity. We need to look at neurobiological and psychosocial measures together. So we need to look at both nature and nurture when we study the transgenerational transmission of trauma. We need both of them. Genetic and environmental factors influence health. We need to look at both the body and the mind. So the conclusion is that studies indicated that survivors gradually reversed the harmful effects of trauma instead of succumbing to the emotional effects of their past tragedies. The Holocaust survivor parents who transformed their lives by finding a new meaning to their legacy also helped the children to find some closure to the multi-generational saga. Traumatization in the first generation can be a risk factor for adverse long-term outcomes in the second. And particular parents passed on various influences to individual children under specific circumstances and at different critical periods through a combination of biological and psychosocial mechanisms. Because even simple organisms learn fundamental survival skills and pass these on to their own skills. Life-changing experiences in Holocaust survivor parents, which result in knowledge useful for survival, are passed on to their offsprings. It becomes part of their very nature, and as such it will probably be passed on also to future generations. So as a last sentence, I look at transgeneration transmission of trauma today more as an evolution. If survival is the name of the game of evolution, the post-war generation of Holocaust survivors and their offspring became masters in it. These are the references of my latest papers. Thank you for your attention, and this is the end of the lecture.